To die laughing must be the most glorious of all glorious deaths. Edgar Allan Poe.
You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Hull.
And I'm Lee Esses.
For today's bonus episode, we wanted to look at the kinds of deaths that have happened throughout history that didn't quite fall into a category that we've covered this month or that we will cover in our last two episodes. So this is about the weird stuff.
Throughout human history, we've always found innovative ways to accomplish whatever our goals are. That's just part of being human. And that also includes torturing and killing your enemies as much as possible. So we were looking at some of the weirder ways to do it at the beginning of the month, and we're like, okay, where does impaling fit in? The death by 1,000 cuts, that could be this, it could be that, but we decided, you know what? It's in our weird stuff category. That's going to be our bonus episode this month.
And so many of them, while they technically fall into a different category, like death by 1,000 cuts, that is a melee form, or impaling could be similar to ranged piercing. It deserves its own dedicated time to talk about. So the first one we want to talk about is impaling. And the first thing when I think of impaling is Vlad the Impaler.
Absolutely. And he's great for this time of year for sure. But first, let's talk about what impaling actually is. To impale something is to stab it with something else and lift it upright. So if I have a ball of mozzarella and a toothpick, I can stab it and then put it upright on my plate. I have impaled the mozzarella. Of course, when it comes to humans, there are two basic ways to do it. It's long ways or short ways across. Vlad was known for the long ways version of it.
Yes. So the death that comes from being impaled is typically very slow because you're kind of bleeding out, but because the spike stays there, it doesn't necessarily allow for a lot of blood flow. So the death can actually happen as a result of dehydration or hunger faster than the slow bleeding out death of actually being impaled. Unless, of course, organs get punctured in the process.
Yeah. If impaling is done quote unquote correctly, then you manage to stab the pike all the way through the body without piercing any of the organs. And so that's why there was this dark artistry attached to this particular form of murdering and displaying your enemies, and what Vlad ended up being known for. Because there's a certain amount of skill of getting the pike going through the body just right to where they can survive. And that was the goal of the impaler, was to get them to survive as long as possible.
And if you haven't picked up already, this episode is going to be fairly gruesome.
Yeah, that's been the whole month so far.
Yeah. I think this is a little more specifically when we start talking about the way that Vlad the Impaler and that technique was used, where it would be stabbed up through the back door and weaved through the torso and out the mouth. So you made like a human kebab.
Yeah. The goal was out the mouth, but more often than not, it would come out through the sternum or perhaps the triangles and the collarbones, those kinds of things. But the really good impalers tend to be the ones who can get it all the way up through the throat and out the mouth.
Now, a form of this that isn't technically impaling because of the whole upright lifting thing, but it's still connected, is when a person would be pinned down, sort of like the vampire myths of being staked. So one form of impaling is that they would be pinned down by several very short stakes through various parts of their body to hold them in a spot.
Yeah, and they would often be alive or mostly alive as this happened. This is the horizontal form of impaling versus the vertical that we were talking about a moment ago. Still not fun. One of the things that I found most fascinating about Vlad the Impaler was that he wasn't shy about his fascination with impaling. He was imprisoned for a portion of time, and while he was in prison, he impaled rodents.
And that's a very tiny drop in the bucket of the things that he was known for and famous for. He did a lot of really terrible things. He employed people to do a lot of really terrible things during his conquesting era. If you're looking for a gruesome yet fascinating topic of interest, you can look him up. He is kind of the inspiration for Dracula, and a lot of those kind of myths stem from his peculiarities with all of that.
Now, on the other side of the continent, there was something kind of similar. This is several centuries later, as far as when we have reports of it occurring. But around Japan, Korea, and that portion of Asia, we have the bamboo torture.
The interesting thing about bamboo is that it grows incredibly fast for a plant, and it can grow up to 3 centimeters per hour. So it is said that the Japanese have used this form of torture on prisoners of war in World War II, where they would basically stick people on a sprouting bamboo, hold them down, tie them down, and let the bamboo grow through the person.
The rumors of this bamboo torture have gone back as far as the 1820s, but there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of super solid evidence that this occurred. A lot of POWs claimed it occurred during World War II, but it may or may not have actually been a thing. I would like to point out, though, that Mythbusters did an episode on this, and they proved it was at least possible to torture someone with bamboo this way.
I think I remember that episode. Didn't they also do the water dripping torture?
I would not be surprised. Yeah. I don't think we had that one in today's episode, though. We have a lot of really weird stuff.
No, I don't think so. Because that's more of a form of torture that doesn't really end in killing somebody. And that's more of what we're talking about, is the things that end up with somebody dead. We're going to jump over to Europe. In ancient Europe, there was a method of execution known as the brazen bull. And this was a hollow bull statue sort of thing, usually with holes where the nose would be and a side door.
What would happen is they would open that side door, put a person inside, and then lock them in, close them up, and then light a fire underneath this metal bowl. It would end up cooking the person inside, which would create steam, which would then whistle out the nose of the bowl, kind of in the same way your tea kettle will when it's boiling and ready to go.
That's horrifying imagery. Thank you so much.
Happy Halloween! Not a great way to go, but an interesting way to go if nothing else.
Yeah. The one thing that's always gotten me is the burning alive, the cooking alive. That always just kind of terrifying.
I think the drowning is my least favorite as far as the options are concerned.
The next one that we have, I believe we've talked about this person in one of our past October episodes. Prince Sato, I'm not entirely sure on the pronunciation, of the mid-1700s in Korea, who was buried alive in a rice chest. When we talked about him before, I believe we discussed it because of the acts and the things that he did during his life, where he was a very abusive ruler. He would take pleasure in abusing slaves and his servants and his family, and most everyone kind of agreed that he was insane.
There are some more modern conspiracy theories that, Sato was framed, blah, blah, blah. But one of the most compelling bits of evidence that we have against Sato is his wife. I apologize, I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce the name. But she had a diary and had a pretty vivid log of what it was like to live with her husband.
One of the excerpts from it said, quote, "For him to get dressed, I have to have 10, 20, or even 30 sets of clothes laid out. He would then burn some, supposedly on behalf of some ghost or other. Even after this, if he managed to get into a suit of clothes without incident, one had to count it as a great good luck. If, however, those serving him were to make the slightest error, He would not be able to put his clothes on, no matter how hard he tried. In the process, people were hurt, even killed. It was truly dreadful.
The problem with this particular scenario that this woman was in was that he was the crown prince. And the rule of the time said that if someone killed the crown prince, then his wife and family would also be executed as traitors. So she couldn't do anything about it without risking herself and her kids.
However, everyone agreed that he had to go, so his dad ended up ordering him to climb into a rice chest on a hot summer day, and then they tied the chest shut with rope and left it on the upper reaches of the palace where he would basically cook inside this rice chest. So because he got into it himself, even on an order, it was a natural death. Nobody actually killed him, supposedly.
If anyone could be said to have killed him, it would have been the gods and the environment. It was not any one person who was to blame for this. That got around the rules enough for the king of Korea at the time to go, we're good. They had servants, and I feel like this is a kind of justice for how much he abused the servants, but they had servants go up a couple of times a day and knock on the chest and see if he would respond. It's like, yep, still alive. So they got to at least hear him on his way out. And he was pronounced dead on the 8th day.
One of my interest pieces of a type of torture that could lead to death actually came from fairy tales, and I believe this might have been used in actual history, but in the original Grimm Brothers' Snow White, the stepmother was actually forced at the end of the tale to put on a pair of red-hot iron shoes and quote-unquote dance until she died.
This is kind of related to a similar death by dancing thing that happened, and this has been known to happen across a couple of different places, and it was the dancing plague. One of the most deadly times for that was the summer of 1518. It's assumed it might be ergot poisoning or something similar, but one person just got up and started dancing. And then anyone who was nearby around them, they would get up and start dancing. And they literally couldn't stop. So over the course of 3 months, 400 people died from dancing themselves to death.
And that's not the only instance of that happening. There are similar records between the 14th and 17th centuries of this happening in various places kind of across the world. But this one in the summer of 1518 is the most well-known version of the story.
There's another one, if we're reaching all the way back to ancient Persia, that feels like a lot of work for what it was, but it's also a very creative way to kill someone. And it's nicknamed the boats, called scaphism, I believe it's pronounced that way. Basically, you would have the victim between two boats. One boat face up, and then the person, and then the other boat face down, kind of like a really absurd Subway sandwich. And their limbs would be sticking out in every direction. The torturers would smear the limbs with milk and honey and let the wilderness infect the body and rot the limbs. While this person was almost suffocating from being in this enclosed environment, their limbs were outside and nature was chewing them apart. It was a particularly dark way to get someone to go. But it was creative.
That's horrifying.
Yes.
When I read in the notes, the boats, my initial thought actually went to keel hauling and the origin of what keel hauling actually is, which is another brutal thing that people would do. If you were keel hauled on a ship, I believe they would tie you to a rope that they would keep attached to the ship somehow, drop you off the bow of the ship, and then let the current and the motion of the ship drag you underneath, and you would get scraped and scratched and basically torn apart by the barnacles as you went from the bow to the stern of the ship.
Yeah, keelholing went back as far as 700 BC, and it was often used by pirates during the time to punish members of their crew who misbehaved in some regard.
And I think that's the connection that we have with all the things that we've talked about so far in this episode is most of these forms of torture and execution were a way to punish someone for something. Sometimes it was a way to punish someone for a crime. Sometimes it was a way to punish an enemy of the state. But it was usually carried out for a purpose in regards to the laws of the land. However, the next category that we want to talk about is deaths that were carried out for a more religious purpose and human sacrifices.
At least for me, when I first think about human sacrifice, the one that comes to mind most prevalently is the Aztecs. What would happen there is they would capture a whole bunch of Spaniards, put them all in the same prison. Every day, they would select a few of them, take them out, and then do the human sacrifice. They would rip out the hearts of the victims, and then cook them and eat them. And they would also eat the meat from the legs and arms and these kind of things, and sacrifice the Spaniards to the gods as a look, we conquered them for you kind of thing. But the mentality of the Spaniards who were prisoners must have been absolutely horrific. It's like, is today the day I'm going to get eaten?
Yeah. And there is something that I want to just quickly put in as a caveat with regards to the Aztecs and a couple of the ones that we have coming up, specifically the Celtic Druids one that I'm about to mention, is that some of these tales and reports could simply be apocryphal because in many cases history is written by the victors and they want to always seem to be the good people. So like in the case of the Celtic Druids, there's reports that they had what was known as the Wicker Man, where they would create a structure of wicker or wood with people or animals inside and then light it on fire as a kind of ritual sacrifice. However, this very well could just be propaganda by the Romans, who were trying to wipe out Celtic beliefs when they were conquering the British Isles. And the same thing could be said for a lot of these different cases, is how much of this actually happened and how much of it was the victor trying to demonize the cultural beliefs of the native people that they were trying to conquer.
This last one, though, we do have quite a bit of evidence for, and that is ancient Egypt. When a king or pharaoh would die, many of his high-ranking servants and officials and religious leaders of his little clan, they would all die also, so that they could continue to serve this king or pharaoh in the afterlife. And we would find a whole bunch of bodies with the king or pharaoh. So lots of evidence in that regard.
Yes. So those are some examples of human sacrifice. Now we want to get back into some other weird ways of dying that were not necessarily specifically meant as torture or execution, but could fall into a variety of different categories.
There is one that I found super interesting just because of the mentality of not only the victim, but the person doing the execution. And that is called slow slicing. It was Chinese, and so it's also called Ling Chi. There was a general in 1630 who didn't do his job well enough and didn't defend the country well enough. So he was accused of collaborating with the enemy because he couldn't defend this one pass. Regardless of if that was true or not, they decided to have a public execution, and not in the guillotine kind of way.
Yeah, this is the death by 1,000 cuts and what coined that phrase, because this general, in public, his skin was sliced and some of his body parts were cut off slowly, but he stayed alive for most of the day because these weren't deep or deadly cuts. It was just a lot of pain and slow slicing before he finally died.
There is another form of killing people slowly by peeling them, and that is the flaying, which is kind of skinning someone alive. That one we're actually putting into the hypothermia category because that's actually what kills them. So if you're looking for that in this episode, we'll actually be talking about that in our next episode. So that's coming up. But it turns out that it's not just terrible things that can kill you. sometimes good things like laughter and food and beer, these can be your worst enemy in the strangest ways possible.
It is possible to eat yourself to death, basically gorge on food until you die. Henry I of England, on the 1st of December in 1135, ate too many lampreys, causing a pain in his gut, probably food poisoning, which led to his death. And you do need to note, he did this against his physician's advice.
I mean, when someone says to you as a physician, I'm going to eat so many eels that I kill myself, it's like, why? Why would you do this to yourself? Like, nope, I'm gonna do it anyway.
I really do wonder what the scenario was of like why his physician was right there to be like, maybe you should stop. Maybe you shouldn't eat that many eels. So weird.
Runs my mind he had like in-laws in town or something. I don't remember exactly what the scenario was, but it was a, hey, let's celebrate, let's get together, and ooh, this is a special food, let's eat it, it's fun, and then just didn't stop. Much like our next example, 650 years later, almost, the Swedish king Adolf Fredrik ate so much food and just binged so much food because Lent was coming up. And it's a very unfriendly but religious time. So for Lent, you give up something, often food in his case, in order to show your devotion to God. So prior to Lent, there's often a huge party and people gorge themselves. This is a lot of what Mardi Gras is based on. This same time, he ate so much lobster and caviar and these other foods for Lent. And then they brought him dessert. It was this little cream-filled bun. I'm not going to try to pronounce it. But it was kind of like an eclair type thing. And he's like, oh, this is good. Even though he had had like 7 or 8 meals worth of food prior to this. He didn't just have 1 or 2. He had 14 servings of these cream-filled buns. That's what killed him.
You know what? If I'm going to go out, I want to die happy too.
Much happier than this next guy, that's for sure.
So fast forward another 200 years, in the 1970s, there was a health food nut called Basil Brown who drank enough carrot juice, a gallon a day, for several days in a row, which caused a overdose of vitamin A in his system that then caused cirrhosis of the liver and caused him to die. All because he drank way too much carrot juice. Which, why? Why would you have that much carrot juice to start with? A gallon a day?
And not just for like one day, it was for, I want to say, weeks, until his body's finally like, you know what? I give up. I will happily die on the 14 servings of cream buns. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would take a death of cream-filled buns over a death of carrot juice. Another weird and interesting way to die is actually to laugh yourself to death.
There are strangely a lot of these on record. I don't know if it was just people had weaker hearts back then and they would just laugh and then keel over, or if it was a trigger for something that put them over the edge, whatever. I have laughed really hard in my day. I've never thought about it killing me.
I wonder what the official way that it would kill you. Would it be like asphyxiation because you just can't breathe anymore?
Maybe, or a heart attack or stroke was my guess.
Yeah, like maybe some like excess blood pressure, maybe popping some veins. Anyway, we'll have to look into that more. Maybe you should look into that more. But here are a couple of examples from history of people laughing themselves to death. In 5th century BC, Greek painter Zeuxis is said to have died laughing at the humorous way in which he painted an old woman. I love that he was laughing at his own painting.
Right? This would be like me editing my book and going, oh, that's a funny joke. Plop. It's like, what? Couple of centuries later, there was a guy called Chrysippus, who was a Greek philosopher, and he reportedly died of laughing after he fed a donkey fermented figs and basically got this donkey drunk. On top of that, he told the slave to give the donkey undiluted wine. So very, very strong alcohol on top of that. And then he laughed so much at the donkey's reaction to being drunk that he died.
I do have to admit, seeing a drunk donkey would be funny. I remember seeing videos in school of monkeys who would get drunk off fermented fruit, and that was funny. So this one might be a little justified. But I do have to say, these deaths don't just happen in ancient Greece, as our two first examples did. In 1989, during the initial run of a film called A Fish Called Wanda, a 71-year-old named Ole Benson reportedly laughed himself to death.
This one is probably more one of those laughing to a heart attack, but if it weren't so morbid, I feel like this is good marketing for the film. It was a comedy.
If it was supposed to be like a tragedy, whew, yikes.
It became a tragedy for one guy in 1989, but... The last weird category that we're going into is 19th century London, which is just its own level of weirdness, the Victorian era especially. They had a couple of incidents, one of which was the beer flood. There was a company in 1814 that had enormous amounts of a porter, a type of beer, in big vats that were right next to the slums. Something went funky with the fermentation. They all burst and then caused the rest of them to burst, releasing something around 150,000 to almost 400,000 gallons of beer that flooded the nearby slums. 8 people ended up dying, several of which were at a funeral for somebody else.
Oh no.
So death by beer is a thing.
And not the standard normal death by beer of like alcohol intoxication, just actual drowning in beer.
Which sounds like it might be another fun way to go, just saying.
Speaking of weird floods, something that we don't have in our notes but that I just thought of was the Great Butter Flood. I think it happened in Wisconsin in like the 20s or 30s. That might be an interesting thing to research for you if you're looking for weird floods. That was part of the issue, is that once they got the water in to put out the fire, it flooded the entire area with butter.
No fatalities, but millions of dollars in damages.
Yeah, it's so much butter everywhere.
Debris everywhere. That was a cheese joke. Never mind. I think I'm hilarious.
So back to London, and Victorian London specifically, and their weird deaths. You have in 1858 the Great London Stink, where the human waste and pollution was so bad it contaminated the Thames and people were dying from it. And it was the worst during the summer, surprise, surprise, when it's nice and hot and all the juices are getting bacteria active in them. It took them a while to figure out how to solve this problem of pollution.
This one had so many political cartoons drawn about it. I highly encourage you to go look some of those up, just because for decades prior to this really bad stink in 1858, there were lots of cholera outbreaks. This one is our largest body count at 34,000 deaths attributed to the pollution in the Thames. But it wasn't until it bucked up against Parliament's building that they're like, maybe we should do something about this.
The biggest issue that came out of this was the cholera and all of the outbreaks, because leading up to 1858, there had been 3 major cholera outbreaks that resulted in like 34,000 deaths. That's a lot of people. It may be just a tiny portion of London population, but you have to consider how many people were suffering as a result of cholera and not dying. That's 34,000 people who died as a result of this contamination, because people were just kind of dumping their waste anywhere and then going into the river. It's kind of a problem when the river is also your source of, drinking water.
It did end up helping us figure out what caused cholera. There was John Snow and what he called the ghost maps, where he literally mapped out where people were dying of cholera during an outbreak. And he was able to link them back to wells in the area. So if a well was contaminated and people were drinking from that well, then they would then go and get cholera and die. This was counter to the bad air philosophy that we were talking about during our asphyxiation episode. So this brought out the germ theory that we follow today.
So this episode has basically just been a drop in the bucket of weird deaths and weird ways that people die and kill each other. There really is no end to human capacity for cruelty and creativity. And when those two overlap, it creates very interesting history. And really, what the history shows us is that nothing is implausible. If you can think of it to put it in your book, someone would probably have done it in history. So use it. Have fun with the writing of it. Because humans are inherently weird, and that's part of why we write. So, of course.
Right, selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.